We shall begin our tour of Latin America's early socialist parties with the Socialist Party of Argentina. This party is the oldest socialist party in Latin America, and it was widely considered the most successful of these parties until the late 1930s. Buenos Aires is one of the first cities in the region to develop a strong socialist movement. And this process is aided by the flow of European immigrants into the city during the late 19th century. Many of these immigrants are coming from countries like Italy, Germany, France, and Spain, which already have well-established organized labor movements, and where workers are already starting to organize into their own socialist political parties. Several socialist newspapers are established in Buenos Aires during the late 1880s, first in foreign languages like German, but later on in Spanish as well. By 1890, Buenos Aires has a number of different socialist clubs, though these organizations are still segregated by ethnicity, and there are separate clubs for German, Italian, and French immigrants. However, these different clubs slowly began to join together for the purpose of coordinating their work. In 1892, some of these clubs form a short-lived Socialist Workers' Federation, and this is followed a year later with a more centralized socialist political party. This party holds its founding congress in 1896, uniting together a variety of different socialist groups throughout the country, including socialist political clubs based in Buenos Aires and the provinces, and 15 socialist labor unions and other labor organizations. The Socialist Party's leader throughout its first 3 decades is the Argentine-born physician Juan B. Justo. As a young man, Justo had joined the civic union of Bartolome Mitre, and he had participated in the Revolution of the Park in 1890. After this uprising was put down, Justo drifted towards socialism, and he helped found the most influential Spanish-language socialist newspaper in Argentina, La Vanguardia, which would later become the official organ of the Socialist Party. Although the party's leading figure is from the professional middle class, most of the Socialist Party's early members are from the working class. The Socialist Party remains a pretty small party throughout the first decade of the 20th century, and by the time that Argentina democratizes in the 1910s, the party still has fewer than 2,000 dues-paying members. But these members are extremely active in the party. They devote a substantial amount of time and effort to building the party further and proselytizing on its behalf. This map shows the locations of Socialist Party neighborhood branches in Buenos Aires in the early 20th century, and this gives us an idea of the scope and breadth of the party's neighborhood organization. This is a non-contemporaneous map, which means that not all of these locals would have existed at the same time. The party always had between 10 and 20 local branches in Buenos Aires throughout the first decades of the 20th century. And these branches were concentrated mostly in working class and lower middle class parts of the city. These local branches are the primary spaces for Socialist Party activism during the party's early decades. And they also form an important part of the Socialist Party's public image. Even though socialist activists are facing state repression at this time, the party goes out of its way to organize out in the open, and it positions its local branches on major streets and other places where they can easily be seen by other people residing in that neighborhood. The party is trying to show the local residents that this party is an active part of their community. Although the party's official membership base remains quite small, the party soon begins to attract a much broader base of sympathizers and supporters. The early Socialist Party focuses much of its attention on labor organizing. In 1901, socialist activists helped found Argentina's first workers' federation alongside anarchist and syndicalist labor activists. However, the socialists almost immediately break away from this federation and they start their own workers' organization called the UGT, which is the first major socialist-led labor federation in Latin America. While the Argentine labor movement is now organizationally divided between an anarchist current and a socialist current, the anarchist and socialist labor activists still come together in a number of major strikes, including the country's first nationwide general strike in 1902 and a tenant strike in Buenos Aires in 1907. Socialism is still very much a minority current within the Argentine labor movement at this time, but the socialists are participating actively in these anarchist-led labor actions because they see this as the best way to expand socialism's influence within the Argentine labor movement. But in contrast to the anarchists, the socialists believe that there is some value to working within the official institutions of government as well. Even though Argentina is still an oligarchy and the National Congress is dominated by the ruling National Autonomous Party, the socialists believe that having even just a single socialist member of Congress would help broaden the party's appeal to the general public. If nothing else, the Congress could at least serve as a platform that socialist politicians could use to denounce Argentina's corrupt political system and educate the working class about what socialism means and what the party is trying to accomplish. The big challenge is getting a socialist elected to Congress in the first place. Remember that Argentina does not have the secret ballot yet, and the ruling party has a history of retaliating against even centrist opposition voters and resorting to electoral fraud when all else fails. So it is unclear whether a socialist candidate would even be allowed to win a congressional election. But as the 1904 legislative election approaches, the Socialist Party catches three very lucky breaks. Its first lucky break is a change in the electoral system. Through 1902, Buenos Aires was a single congressional district in which a dozen congressmen were elected at large. Argentina still used a majoritarian electoral system, so these dozen seats would always go to the largest political party, the National Autonomous Party, leaving no seats for any smaller parties. But in 1904, the government changes the electoral system and it makes each parroquia or neighborhood in the city its own congressional district, which will elect one member of Congress each. The reason why this change benefits the Socialist Party is because the party's base of support is heavily concentrated among working class neighborhoods specifically. The Socialist Party is not nearly large enough to win a city-wide election yet, but it may be able to win an election in a particular neighborhood. Perhaps a neighborhood with a predominantly working class immigrant population that is located right next to the city port and which has a history of labor unrest and political radicalism. And if you are familiar with Buenos Aires, then you know that I am of course referring to the neighborhood of La Boca, the most quintessentially blue-collar neighborhood in the Ciudad Autónoma. If there is any congressional district in the country that a socialist candidate can win, it is surely the district that contains La Boca. And the Socialist Party concentrates its efforts in the 1904 election on this particular district, running its largest and best organized electoral campaign yet. The Socialist Party's second lucky break is that Argentina's largest opposition party, the UCR, is taking an extended break from elections at this time. The UCR is currently preparing for its ill-fated revolution of 1905, and it is not even bothering to compete in elections that it knows it cannot win. As a result, the Socialist Party has the opposition vote in La Boca all to itself. The party's third lucky break is that too many right-wing candidates run in La Boca's single-member district in 1904. And they end up splitting the pro-government vote, The socialist candidate Palacios wins only a third of the vote in this district, but with the rest of the field so badly divided, this third is enough for him to win the seat. Alfredo Palacios is the first member of a Socialist Party to get elected to Congress in any country in the Americas. Palacios is a rather unlikely figure to represent a still predominantly working-class Socialist Party. He is something of a dandy. He has a flamboyant and aristocratic demeanor, and he gets along pretty well with the members of Argentina's elite parties. Palacios eventually gets expelled from the Socialist Party in 1915 for fighting a duel against a fellow party member. But in the meantime, his election to Congress benefits the party in a number of ways. First, it helps provide badly needed financing to this perpetually cash-strapped party. Under the party's rules, socialist elected officials must donate their salaries to the party treasury. And during the years that Palacios is in office, around a third of the party's revenues come from Palacios' congressional salary alone. Palacios is also a very active legislator. During his 1904 to 1908 term, he introduces a ton of new legislation aimed at improving the well-being of workers and other marginalized groups, including a Sunday rest bill, labor protections for women and children, proposals for an 8-hour workday, workers' safety standards, the abolition of the death penalty, protections for immigrants, and restrictions on trafficking and sexual exploitation. The Congress as a whole is still very right-wing at this time, so most of these bills do not become law in Argentina until much later. But to everyone's surprise, Palacios is able to persuade the Congress to pass these first two initiatives during his first term, the Sunday Rest Law and the Labor Protections Law. These legislative successes demonstrate that socialists can get meaningful reforms passed through Argentina's right-wing Congress, and it encourages many leaders within the Socialist Party to take congressional elections more seriously going forward. The Socialist Party's turn towards electoralism is also reinforced by Argentina's democratization between 1912 and 1916. As we saw in an earlier video, Argentina adopts an electoral reform in 1912 that introduces the secret ballot, and this reform also changes the electoral system in a way that makes it easier for the second largest party to win representation in Congress. Under the new system, 2/3 of the seats in each congressional district go to the largest party, while 1/3 of the seats is reserved for the second largest party. This new change in the electoral rules benefits the Socialist Party because this party is now consistently one of the two largest parties in the congressional district of Buenos Aires City. Over the following elections, the Socialist Party's representation in Congress steadily grows, and the party has 19 members of Congress by 1924. The Socialist Party's electoral rise coincides with a major shift in its electoral base. This graph comes from an analysis of class-based voting in Argentina by the political scientists Noam Lupu and Susan Stokes, and they are using voters' literacy as a proxy for social class. Negative numbers along the y-axis indicate that the party receives more support from illiterate voters, while positive numbers indicate that it receives more support from literate voters. In 1912, the Socialist Party's voters are still overwhelmingly illiterate, which suggests that the party still had a largely working-class base. But in all of the following elections, it receives a greater share of votes from literate voters, indicating that its base of support has now shifted towards the middle class and the educated working class. This measurement of social class is obviously limited, but this analysis does fit the conventional wisdom about the Argentine Socialist Party. Somewhere between 1910 and 1930, this party ceased to be a militant proletarian party and it transformed into a very moderate reformist party that drew its electoral support primarily from the urban middle class. Around this same time, the Socialist Party also distances itself from labor organizing. In 1917, the party's national leader, Juan B. Justo, declares that the Socialist Party should not involve itself in the labor organizations. It can only and should only support them from outside, in cases where the laws, the government, and the public administration pertain to the labor unions. In other words, from now on, the Socialist Party is no longer going to get directly involved in the increasingly violent labor struggles on the streets and in the workplaces. The party is only going to support the labor movement indirectly from inside the Congress. There are still socialist labor activists in Argentina, and some of them do become major figures in the labor movement by the 1930s. But the party leadership is opposed to creating any formal organizational linkage between the party and the labor unions. Now that the party is relying on a middle-class electoral base, the party feels that it is important to maintain the party's autonomy and independence from organized labor. Under Argentina's first democracy, elections have now become the party's primary focus, and the socialists do perform pretty well in elections for a time. I want to end this video with an overview of the party's long-term electoral performance, since this is now one of the main standards by which the party judged its own success. The party had a rough start in the pre-democratic elections held under Argentina's oligarchic government, though it was still able to pull off some surprising successes with the election of Palacios in 1904. It is with the onset of democracy in 1912 that the Socialist Party truly begins to flourish in elections. It never holds more than 12% of the seats in Congress during this period, but it still outperforms every other socialist party that existed in the Americas at this time. But this success does not last. The party suffers a major split in 1927, and it loses most of its seats in Congress in the following two elections. Argentina's first democracy is overthrown in 1930, and the Socialist Party achieves the best election results in its history under the dictatorship in the 1930s. Its representation peaks at 27% of the seats in Congress in 1934. However, the Socialist Party owes this success mostly to the fact that the country's largest party, the UCR, is no longer participating in elections, and the Socialist Party is the only opposition party running in most of the provinces. Opposition voters are casting ballots for the Socialist Party mostly as a protest vote. As soon as the UCR participates in elections again, the socialist vote plummets. And then when the Peronist movement emerges in the mid-1940s, the Socialist Party loses all of its congressional representation. The party still exists today, but it never again wins more than 5% of the seats in Congress. So in the end, the 12-year period between 1914 and 1926 is the only period in which the Socialist Party actually performs moderately well in democratic elections. The proximate cause of the party's decline in the late 1920s is its 1927 split. But over the longer run, the reason why the Socialist Party fails to consolidate its position as a major force in Argentine politics is closely related to the party's decision to distance itself from the labor movement and concentrate instead on winning the support of middle-class voters. This decision made a lot of sense in the 1910s and 20s, since working-class participation in elections was still pretty low, and middle-class voters were the ones who were the most interested in what the Socialist Party was offering. However, this shift in the party's electoral base made it harder for the party to mobilize working-class electoral support later on. During the 1930s dictatorship, the Socialist Party passes up on an opportunity to build a stronger relationship with the new labor confederation, the CGT. After the decline of the anarchist movement in the early 1930s, socialist labor activists are now some of the leading figures within the Argentine labor movement. A different political party might have capitalized on this rare moment of socialist leadership by turning the CGT into the labor arm of the party. But the Argentine Socialist Party leadership has no interest in becoming a labor party, and it refuses to establish any formal linkages with the CGT. The socialist labor activists eventually conclude that they are not receiving enough support from their party, and many of them end up defecting to the Peronist Labor Party in the 1940s. The Peronists become the labor-based party that the Socialist Party refuses to be, and this has the effect of displacing the Socialist Party from Argentina's party system.